Hello there, and welcome back to the Chap's Guide, the channel where we go on a journey of exploration on the topics of men's style, self-development and personal grooming. And today, well, our subject today was suggested to me by a viewer who wrote in and said, wouldn't it be a good idea to discuss how the military has influenced men's style over the generations? And I thought, actually, what a great idea. I have a military background myself, and I can see when I look into it how many of the military styles have changed the way that we dress today. So hence the reason I'm wearing an old combat jacket. But let's sit down and we'll talk about those things that have made their way into common use, which began in the military. So the first item I want to talk about is something that we've probably all got in a cupboard somewhere at home. And for me, living where I do, I wear it almost every day. And that's the Wellington Boot, because its origin story goes way back into the 1800s, where Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, became aware that the boots that were issued to his men were utterly inadequate. And this caused many injuries and debilitating problems such as foot rot and the like, which caused his men to be unfit to take part in combat. So he commissioned the St. James bootmaker called Hobie's in London to make an all-round better boot for his men. And the resulting boot was known as the Wellington Boot, after the person who commissioned it, the Duke of Wellington. Now that boot went on to be universally successful in the military. It allowed soldiers to keep their feet warm and dry, which, believe me, when you're in the military, that's something which is a really high priority for you. Over time, it was enormously successful in the First World War, and today, as I say, pretty much all of us make use of the Wellington Boot in our daily lives. But it all goes back to the Duke of Wellington and his desire to make a better boot for his foot soldiers at the time of the Waterloo battle and all of those other Napoleonic wars. Now, the most commonly worn accessory for most of us gentlemen is the necktie, or occasionally the cravat, as I'm wearing today, as an alternative. But you wouldn't have thought that goes back to the military. How could it possibly? It's purely a decorative neck adornment. Well, actually, it does. It can stem its history way back to the 30 Years' War, which took place centuries ago between the European powers, and France being one of the main protagonists within that 30 Years' War. And as was commonly the place back then, France employed a number of other nationalities, mercenary soldiers in effect, to participate in that war on their behalf. Now, one of the nations which they turned to were the Croatians, and they were in the habit of wearing a neck adornment, just a scarf tied around the neck, all generally in the same colour, so they could identify themselves, a form of uniform, if you will, on the battlefield. Now, there was no real name for this neck adornment, this scarf, so when the Croats came to France, to Paris, which was obviously a very high society, fashion conscious city back then, as it is today, the Parisians noticed these neck adornments that were being worn by the Croatians, and they started to wear them themselves. Now, as they had no given name, they called them the Croats, because they stemmed from the Croatians. And over time, that Croat has been aberrated to cravat. And that, of course, started off the journey of evolution, which leads us to wear the neckties that we all wear today. But it did start in the military, in the 30 Years' War, and like many of these great stories, it started with something quite simple. Now, one perennial item which exists in many men's outerwear wardrobes is the peacoat, and this can stem its history way back to the early 1720s, when we first see them being worn by seamen from the navies from all different nationalities, and they were just really easy to make, functional utility garments that can be worn by the mariners when they're out at sea, working on the deck, or perhaps when they're visiting a cold climate when they're in port. So it was a nice garment, easy to run up by the tailors on the ship, and that's why they were sort of universally accepted into the kind of unofficial uniform initially of the navies of the world, and then of course today, it's ebbed its way into common use. So where does the P in peacoat come from? Well, it's believed, there's a couple of different origin stories. One is the Dutch word, which I can't even say, which would be the peacoat in Dutch, and because it's difficult to say, they use P instead. Or the alternative is that in the US Navy, the garment was made by using a material called pilot cloth, and it was called peacoat because of that association with pilot cloth. But goes back in time, worn today by many, many men. Now, one garment which is deeply steeped in military history is the good old cardigan that I'm wearing today. Owned by many and loved by many in the winter and the cooler times of year. And its history within the military is very clear. Now, I'm going to take you back to the mid-1800s, to the Crimean War, where the British were fighting the Russians up there in the Crimea in Russia, and obviously a very cold, desolate part of the world. And the wearing of additional layers of clothing were necessary by the soldiers involved to stop themselves freezing. Now, one of the commanders, a general by the name of the Earl of Cardigan, you can see where this is going. He was a particularly vain gentleman, and he didn't like pulling jumpers over his head because it messed with his hair. So as an alternative, he had commissioned a jumper which had been cut open and had buttons placed on the front, hence creating a garment which could be slipped on over the shoulders instead of pulled over the head. Now, this became very popular because people obviously enjoyed putting on clothing a lot easier. And over time, it gained the name of the first person who commissioned the garment, and that is the Earl of Cardigan. So that's why these garments are called cardigans. Simple but interesting historical story. Now, the next garment I want to talk about is one which is very heavily represented in my wardrobe, and that's the good old Chino trouser. And the Chino, for me, Swiss Army clothing. You know, you can wear this with everything. It's good for semi-formal and casual wear. But where does its origin story begin? Well, it starts way back in the late 1800s with the American and Spanish War. Now, the Spanish forces issued a trouser to their forces called the pantaloon chino. And of course, pantaloon being trouser, Chino referring to the material which the trousers were made of, which was of Chinese origin. And over time, as often is the case, both forces, capture bits of their logistics and supplies, and they press them into service within their own endeavours. And the pantaloon chino was seized or captured by some Americans, and they started to press them into service in the warm European climate where that war took place, and they were found to be highly practical, highly useful trousers. Hence, they got taken back to America and widely used as a uniform trouser, and also then entering the civilian world as a casual, practical trouser. And that's where the Chino trouser begins its origin story, as the pantaloon chinos in the American-Spanish War. Now I'm holding these Chino trousers, it's worth talking about the colour and where that stems from. Of course, this colour we'll recognise immediately as khaki, and it's probably the most prevalent colour that you'll find the Chino trouser in anywhere. It's just a good practical colour that blends in so nicely with so many other different colours. It's kind of a neutral, isn't it? But where does it stem from? Well, we can look back in history to a chap called Harry Lumsden. Now, Lumsden was a lieutenant in the British Army, and he was serving in India during that period referred to today as the British Raj. And he would have been issued in the 1800s the British military uniform of the time, which involved a bright coloured jacket and white trousers or breeches. And this was utterly impractical, not just for camouflage purposes, but also for keeping clean. So he had this plan, and what he did, he took his trousers and he dyed them a different colour using tea, it's believed, and the colour which was born of that experiment was the khaki colour, and it was seen as being a really practical colour, easier to keep clean. There's nothing more difficult than trying to keep white clean in a subtropical environment, as you can imagine. But the khaki colour was practical in daily use and also provided a bit of that all-important camouflage, which can be so vital to soldiers in combat. Over time, it was copied by others, and like so many things, evolution takes place and khaki becomes the official colour of the British military. And that's the origin story of the colour khaki. Now another garment we'll all recognise, and that's the good old denim jeans. And you wouldn't have thought this had a military history, but actually it does. And it's a plus point to the US Navy here, who in 1901 started issuing denim trousers to their sailors who were looking for a more practical utility pair of trousers that they could wear while working on ship, and just, far more comfortable garment. And as is often the case, something that's issued to the military, when people cease serving, they'll take those items home, they'll wear them in their civilian lives. They will be seen by people who like the look of them, and they will expand and then go on to become an item of style for the general population. Now, most people don't know of that military history. It was, up to that point, a niche garment which would have been worn by miners and cowboys, but actually it hadn't really got a grip with the wider population. So it is from the US Navy that the true democratization of the denim jean entered public usage and became today probably the most common pair of trousers that anyone will wear in the world. Now the next item I'm going to talk about is perfect for today, and that's the Aviator sunglasses. Because on this warm sunny day in spring here in the UK, the sun is beating down and perfect for shading the eyes, but also loved by most men because the style, the simplistic style, suits so many people's facial shapes. So where does the story of the Aviator sunglasses begin? Well, it begins in the interwar period between the First and Second World Wars, where aviation was really reaching its zenith, and more people were taking to the skies, not just as military pilots but as civilian pilots, and people were searching around for something to protect their eyes from the glare of the sun. Now up to this point, people would have had to have worn goggles with some sort of shading on them to protect their eyes, and they wanted some form of improvement to that, and the sunglasses were created. Now the very first easily identifiable aviator sunglasses we can see coming from the 1950s, where pilots started wearing these distinctive shaped frames and very practical utilitarian glasses which were used in the air, and obviously when they came back to ground they would wear them when they weren't flying as well, and that's where these glasses got their foothold within the general population. Now I've owned this pair of Ray-Ban aviator glasses for the best part of 20 years at least, and they're still going strong. I wear them every summer, and they just fit so well with other clothing and other styles that I will wear, because they're quite simple. And as many things with fashion and style, simple is the key. So the aviator sunglasses, another thumbs up to the military aviation industry. Now the next item which I want to talk about stays with the aviation industry, and that's the bomber jacket, that quintessential cool weather jacket favoured by so many men for the winter and the autumn time of year, when you need something to keep you a bit warmer and a bit snuggly. And the bomber jacket stems itself back to the United States Air Force yet again, also to about the 1950s, when the military forces were looking to replace the all-leather jacket which was worn by aviators to keep them warm when they were up flying in those high altitudes and resulting cold temperatures. And what was selected was a lightweight nylon jacket which could be padded, which was a lot cheaper than the leather jacket, and also highly practical. It would dry out a lot quicker if it got wet, and hence we see the birth of the bomber jacket. Now I love a bomber jacket because it's perfectly casual, and it's something which you can wear just when you're out and about. It doesn't take any effort to style it, and you can also wear it with a collar and tie if you really want to. But the bomber jacket, again, thanks to the US Air Force. Now one garment which is less loved by those who are sartorially sort of well connected, and that's the cargo trousers, or particularly the cargo shorts. And what sort of identifies the cargo shorts? It's these extra pockets generally on the leg which are used for potential storage, but never get used for that. Where does that come from? Well, we can go back to the 1930s, where the British Army introduced their new battle dress uniform, and on the trousers of that battle dress uniform there were extra pockets on either legs. One was for a field dressing. If you got shot or injured, your immediate sort of dressing could be placed in there. And on the other side, there was a pocket which was larger which could be used to house a map. So keep a folded map, clean and tidy in your trouser pocket. Now over time, as people did, they leave the military, they take their uniforms with them and they wear them in general life. And that cargo style became fashionable as it is today. Now, I don't mind wearing cargo shorts. I'm not a Philistine totally. I do enjoy them, because they're practical, but I understand that they are perhaps not the most popular with the well-dressed gentleman. Now, the last item I'm going to talk about today is the good old desert boot, a staple in many men's summer footwear collections, and one, well, I've always got a pair of desert boots in my collection because they're just so practical and comfortable as well, an important function. But where does it begin? Well, I'm going to take you back to the 1940s now, the Second World War, and the British are fighting in Burma. And there's a chap called Nathan Clark. Now, he's a son of a huge shoe empire in the UK called Clark Shoes. And while he's out there, he's got his eye open for new items which can be brought back and introduced into the Clark's footwear line. And he notices that many of his fellow officers are wearing a non-uniform boot. They're wearing what we now recognise as the desert boot. And being a canny fellow, he could see that they were more practical, comfortable. They're made with a single piece of suede leather on the upper, and the sole is made of crepe, or which is a coagulated latex product. And these are much more practical for use in the environments, in the combat theatres that they were fighting in. So he made it his business to find out where they came from. He went back to a bazaar in Cairo, discovered the shoemaker who was making these boots for his fellow officers. He bought a number of examples, brought them back to the UK, and lo and behold, they were placed into production and became the eponymous desert boot, which is still probably one of the most popular gentlemen's boots in manufacture anywhere in the world today. But it all goes back to the Second World War. Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's conversation around how the military has influenced the style of gentlemen in the modern era. And I actually, when I did this research, I had to limit it to the small number of items that I've talked about today, because this is an expansive field. You'll be amazed the breadth of influence that the military has had on the way that we dress every day, even in the 21st century. Now, if you have enjoyed this video, I would encourage you to give us a thumbs up and leave us a comment in the comment section below. It was a comment which led to today's topic being discussed, so I do take note of them, and where possible I will create a video to accompany those comments as well. So thanks for listening, take care of yourselves, and I will see you again very soon.